My name is Kathleen Brown, and I'm the David Boyce Professor of History and the Director of the Alice Paul Center for Research on Gender, Sexuality, and Women. I've also been privileged to serve as the lead historian on the Pen and Slavery Project, a student-driven research project that began in fall 2017 and has changed the conversation about Penn's historical complicity in slavery. A few announcements first. This conference is being recorded, so if you don't want to be recorded, don't stand in front of the camera. That's simple.
And thank you all for being here. I'm not surprised, but I'm heartened that we have a full house to talk about a very difficult but a really important topic. I'm very pleased to be here, and let me just give a couple of opening remarks to hopefully frame a little bit of the conversation. So let's start with this fact. Any large institution, or old institution, and the creation and dissemination of knowledge, all with the goal of improving society. So understanding our complicated history is fundamental to actually doing the things that I said, right? Acknowledging our history, figuring out what it means, and moving forward is crucial to this. And that is the purpose of the Pen and Slavery Project.
Thank you, Wendell. On behalf of the University of Pennsylvania Libraries and our Director and Vice Provost, Constantino, I'm very pleased to welcome you to the Pen and Slavery Symposium. The University of Pennsylvania Libraries have been enthusiastic supporters and sponsors of the Pen and Slavery Project from its beginnings, and we co-host with the Provost's Office the position of Alexis Broderick Newman, the postdoctoral fellow for the Pen and Slavery Project. The goals of the project align with key aspects of the library's core mission. We're adding to our crucial work as custodians and curators of archives. We're providing infrastructure to support research, expanding access to knowledge, and creating interdisciplinary opportunities through which students from the humanities can work with exciting new technologies. Through the work of the Pen and Slavery Project, students are indeed conducting research in the Kislak Center's collections. And I was privileged to listen to one of their presentations in the Lee Library, which was truly an amazing and moving moment. And I would encourage you during the course of this symposium to go and look at some of the materials that we have on display at the Lee Library, where there are some very profound and moving testimonies to our past. The undergraduates are also working with the Digital Scholarship Department and Pen Immersive here at the libraries to create exciting new augmented reality programming, which you will hear more about tomorrow. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce the scholars on tonight's round table, and perhaps you'd kindly come up and take your positions. Thank you very much. Furthest from me is Deirdre Cooper Owens. She is an Associate Professor of History at Queens College, CUNY, in Queens, New York, and an Organization of American Historians Distinguished Lecturer. She is a graduate of two historically black colleges and universities, Bennett College and Clark Atlanta University, and earned her PhD from UCLA. Professor Cooper Owens is the director of the program in African American history at the Library Company of Philadelphia, the country's oldest lending library, founded in 1731. Her first book, Medical Bondage, Race, Gender, and the Origins of American Gynecology, won the 2018 Darlene Clark Hine Book Award, the best book written in African American women's gender and gender history. Currently, she's working on a second project that examines mental illness during the era of United States slavery, and is also writing a popular biography of Harriet Tubman that examines her through the lens of disability. In fall 2019, she will join the Department of History at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln as the inaugural Linda and Charles Wilson Professor in the History of Medicine and Director of the Humanities in Medicine program. In the middle is Dorothy Roberts. Dorothy Roberts is the 14th Penn Integrated Knowledge Professor and George A. Weiss University Professor of Law and Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. She's also the founding director of the Penn Program on Race, Science and Society in the Center for Africana Studies. An internationally recognized scholar and social justice advocate, she has been a leader in transforming public thinking and policy on reproductive health, child welfare, and bioethics. She is the author of the award-winning books Killing the Black Body, Race, Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty, Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare, and most recently, Fatal Invention, How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century. Closest to me is Kathy Brown. Professor Brown is the David Boies Professor of History and the Director of the Alice Paul Center for Research on Gender, Sexuality, and Women at the University of Pennsylvania. She is also a faculty affiliate of the Africana Studies and the History and Sociology of Science, and the lead historian on the Pen and Slavery Project. She is the author of 2 prize-winning books, Good Wives, Nasty Wenches, and Anxious Patriarchs, Gender, Race, and Power in Colonial Virginia, and Foul Bodies, Cleanliness in Early America. She is currently completing a history of abolition, Undoing Slavery, Abolitionist Body Politics and the Argument Over Humanity, which is forthcoming with the University of Pennsylvania Press, and this considers how the campaign to end slavery entangled activists in a messy and complex process of undoing long-standing practices and habits of the body. And perhaps I could ask Professor Brown to kick off the discussion of this round table. Thank you.
So I imagined really that I was just going to throw out really provocative questions, and our 2 distinguished speakers are really just going to carry the day, and so that's my story. I'm sticking to it here. First, I want to say it's just a tremendous honor to be on this panel with both of you, and I'm really excited because many of us have been influenced and inspired by Dorothy Roberts' critical work looking at really a critical analysis of knowledge production, right? Which is in a certain way what all of us hope to do with our work, to think about not just what we think we say we can know, but also a kind of critical eye on how we got there and what it means that we got there and the way we did. So her work has been really inspirational in having us all think about the ways that deeply embedded and very problematic ideas about race have been part of the legacy of medical science in this country and continue to affect serious disparities in health outcomes for people of color in this country. And with Dorothy's work, which has been so influential for so many of us, even somebody like me who's an early Americanist, we also have Judy Owens, whose book is a recent addition that builds very much on the legacy of Dorothy's work and specifically looks at the ways that experiments and procedures on the bodies of enslaved women gave medical science some of its early legitimacy, some of its basis for making the knowledge claims it did, but she also adds to that a way of complicating that story. We are familiar with that story, but helping us understand that these women were not simply passive participants in this, but they also became recipients and critics of the knowledge being produced. So we're really lucky to have both of them here. The first obvious question would be for us together to kind of take stock of the legacy of slavery's use of black bodies. And in some ways, like the really obvious story you might come out with is a kind of a continuity over time, right? That we know we're seeing something that's continuous. I'd really like us to get in the weeds a little bit and try to figure out, perhaps naive on my part, where is exactly are these continuities and how would we, I mean, if we know about them more than just the kind of general continuity, does that help us root them out better? Does that help us understand the politics better? Does it give us different strategies in the present day? So that's my goal going forward, is that we do some brainstorming about these connections. So if we think back to Benjamin Rush and the founding of, the tradition of medical education in Philadelphia, but also particularly at Penn, how did this foundation structure professional training and subsequent knowledge production in ways that embedded the racial and racist assumptions that allowed race science, in quotes, to flourish in the antebellum United States. And I suspect that each of you probably have an answer in mind, so I'm going to turn it over to both of you.
All right. You see how Dorothy does that, right?
She said yes.
Well, I've been taking notes. And first, let me just say, this is for me a fangirl moment that I could not have dreamed of. Both of these scholars' work informed my own, and they're both cited in my book and my dissertation. So it's really a joy to be here, even though we're talking about a subject that is not as joyous as I'm feeling. So in terms of the medical education, ideas about racial formation theory, all of those things, what I'd like to do is really go back to Kathleen's first question about continuities. And I think, I don't want to be arrogant enough to say that I'm speaking for everyone, but I think for the ways that many of us have been taught in this country, we haven't really been taught the magnitude of slavery and the kind of deep linkages of slavery in terms of the roots of this country. And so I remember trying to locate a dissertation topic and learning about James Marion Sims and gynecology and the experimental nature of that branch, particularly with enslaved women, and being really disheartened because I was a graduate of 2 HBCUs. One of them a Black Women's College. And then my mother also has a degree in professional biology, so I remember calling her and asking, had you heard of experimentation on enslaved people? And she had not. And it was shocking to me. She said, well, there's Tuskegee. So for me, the point of origin story always started in the 20th century. And it tended to focus on the government and Black men, and I didn't think slavery had anything to do with it until I discovered what a lot of historians of medicine already knew, that in this country, several branches of medicine were literally built, constructed on the bodies of those who were owned. And so I think a part of the kind of political push for me writing this book is to be able to present people with a more accurate, precise understanding of slavery's relationship with medicine, but also to be able to give it some dimension. So that's one thing. The other thing regarding medical education, right? So Benjamin Rush is seen as kind of the father of American medicine. It seems like in the history of medicine, we love to call people fathers of everything. So here he is, a founding father, but also the father of American medicine. And what becomes really interesting to me, and I learned a lot from Christopher Willoughby, who's here, and also Rana Asali Hogarth, who writes about medicalizing Blackness. Rush talks about Blackness as a disease, as a pathology. So he links Blackness, literally the hue, to leprosy, and that one could somehow evolve out of Blackness, right? And so, although people love to talk about this kind of abolitionist stance, that doesn't mean that he was a proponent of even the notion of racial equality for the colonial period, right? So one could possibly, through the tutelage, through association with white folk, grow out of Blackness, be cured of this pathology. And so, in many ways, you see this being repeated, right? 18th century, 19th century, 20th century, 21st century. And I think this is where Dorothy Roberts' work is so important, because I just said to her, my God, you keep educating people on Twitter. She's constantly trying to tell people about the fallacies and the racial fictions around racialized medicine in the 21st century. And so, for me, I think understanding the really racist and anti-Black foundations of American medicine is something we must grapple with, because this is not just about the men, right? They create the structure that creates the institution of American medicine. And that's the thing that continues to, unfortunately, be really harmful to poor people and Black people.
Yes, I so agree that it's so important to get to the deep roots of many ideas in medicine, in research, broadly speaking, biomedical, but also sociological and psychological and neuroscientific and all sorts of ways of thinking about human difference that are so common and so taken for granted in research and practice. And so often we can trace those roots. I think all the time we can trace them. I'm still always amazed, but not so surprised at the common practices today that you can trace back almost directly, sometimes without any change, over centuries into medical practice today, or that have just taken on a new garb of scientific accuracy, especially using genes and brain scans and high-tech methods, but the concepts to slavery. So Deirdre emphasized the experimentation and the actual use of Black people's bodies and how that was such a foundation for biomedical research and medical education. I want to also, you alluded to this, but I want to emphasize even more and elaborate more on the very racial concept of disease, and which is, of course, is related to the very biological concept of race. So the idea that human beings are divided naturally into races, and that those races have peculiar diseases and experience common diseases differently, comes out of slavery. It comes out of slavery because doctors and biomedical researchers like Samuel Cartwright, who trained at Penn and trained with Benjamin Rush, wanted to justify slavery by saying it was good for Black people, that slavery benefited Black people for medical reasons. And this is a very powerful way of justifying the most atrocious practices by saying it's good for the victims and survivors of those practices. It also is a way of shoring up the idea that human beings are naturally divided into races, with some human beings destined to dominate and others destined to be enslaved and subordinate to them. And so Samuel Cartwright's view of the peculiar diseases of the Negro, including that Black people have lower lung capacity and therefore had to be forced to work. They were only healthy under the white man's control, as he says, chained to barbarism and ignorance when they were in freedom. He literally says this. And so this kind of thinking of biological race as a justification for inequality, as an excuse for inequality, as the reason for inequality, those ideas have continued over the centuries, and maybe we can talk more about how the transition, but today they're still deeply embedded in medical practice, so much so that doctors today are taught to treat patients by race. And it's in medical technology that Black people's bodies are different and abnormal compared to other people's bodies, all other human beings' bodies. Glomerular filtration rate, for example, which is a test to determine kidney function, automatically is produced with a correction for race. This is common in other areas of medical practice as well, correcting for Black race, as if Black people automatically and categorically have different types of bodies from all other human beings. I'm not making this up. This is today's medical practice, that every doctor who gets a lab report, other than changes that are right now students are making, medical students are making in some hospitals, but almost all doctors will get that lab report with this automatic correction based on the assumption that Black people's bodies are abnormal. So picking up on what Judy said, the idea that Blackness itself is pathological, that idea is very common in hypotheses that say, for example, black race independent of other factors. And my students in the audience will know that I have used this study, a study that is very recent. The black race independent of other factors causes higher rates of preterm birth in black women. What does that mean? Black race, independent of, as if there is some, again, essence of black predisposes black people to bad outcomes. And that idea is the quintessential, the most powerful idea for justifying structural racism and ignoring it. Because every bad outcome that comes from inequality, whether we're talking about slavery or Jim Crow or today's forms of structural racism, then gets explained away as it's just another example of the innate pathological outcomes that come from being black. And so that idea that is rooted in slavery is what we need to uproot. And I think it's in relation to your question about how do we uproot these, we have to show this underlying racial thinking, and which is racist. I'm not trying to, it's racial thinking that is racist that continues to dominate much of medical and research agendas and hypotheses today. And I do believe that showing its roots in slavery can help people understand what's wrong with it, because it's taken for granted today. And I think that people understand where it came from and how it was used, and compare how it continues to serve similar purposes today. It's a powerful racial inequality that exists in the United States and the world today.
Yes, just real quick. I literally just had an aha moment. This is nothing new to anybody who read my book. So I do what historians are not supposed to do. I told all my business in the afterward. I was like, I'm going to mess up and dismantle your objectivity. So in the afterward, I could not have imagined when I was first writing the dissertation that becomes medical bondage that my husband and I would be undergoing IVF. And I remember after having a really horrific experience with the first specialist, we went to the second. I felt a lot more comfortable with this woman. And I remember for the first time ever, asked my husband to come in the examination room with me. And there are lots of reasons. On paper, we're alike, right? We check off the same racial boxes. We met at Clark Atlanta, all of these things. But he is the whitest looking black man you will ever meet. So I thought, if I take my full white man into the examination room, perhaps I'll be protected. So, he's there, I'm there, we're scared because we had, undergone some not so good things. Literally after the examination, the doctor says to me, oh my, she says, we'll probably need to perform a C-section. And I said, what's wrong? And she says, your womb is really small, like your uterus is really, really tiny. I don't think you'll be able to carry the baby to full term. Now, I didn't know about this study.
Yeah.
And then she says, do you have hypertension? And I said, no. I only take a fiber tablet and multivitamins because I'm in my mid-40s. And so she says, oh, no. I mean, are you sure? I said, no. I'm positive. I'm not sick. And she says, well, you'll probably develop hypertension, and I'm not lying to you. My husband said gestational diabetes.
Right.
She says, but your womb is really small. I don't think you can carry the baby to term.
Yeah.
And she had only literally come to this conclusion after performing an ultrasound. I go to the third specialist, and I'm like, so my uterus is really small. They're like, really? No, it's not. And literally, here I am writing a book about these people who create racial science and ideas about race. And I wasn't equipped with the knowledge to know, right, that what she was saying was based on something that comes from the 18th and 19th century.
Exactly. Absolutely. Assumptions about black women's pelvises, about kidney function, the glomerular filtration rate, you might ask, why are black people categorically treated differently? Why is the blood test corrected if you're black or African American versus other? It's because of the belief that black people as a race have more muscle mass than other people as a race. And on Twitter we were joking, a doctor said, well, I can tell muscle mass by putting my patients on a scale. Wouldn't that be more precision medicine than saying, as a race, black people have more muscle mass? There are simple ways you could correct it, but believe me, I get resistance and others do too, when we say, let's take that correction out of glomerular filtration. How could that help? It can't possibly help. It can't possibly be true. It's based on an absurd assumption. But there's a reluctance, there's a sense, but it's got to be true that black people's bodies are different. And so common sense among supposedly highly educated and trained people goes out because of these deeply embedded ideas about, especially about black people's pathological and abnormal bodies.
So I want to push us a little bit, though, and excuse what might sound like a kind of flip example, but I'll give it anyway and hope you'll understand the spirit of it. I teach this course on modern America, and I asked my students if they knew who either Mae West or Josephine Baker were. No, nobody knew anything. And so I guess my reason for raising that is so much of what we might think of in a particular moment as kind of canonical knowledge that gets deeply embedded and persists, doesn't persist, right? This generation of people who work like this on their cell phones, I have to do that, I have to go like this, they don't know who Mae West is, and they don't know who Josephine Baker is, which I think, like, where did that knowledge go? What happened to that? So how is it that something from the early 20th century that has to do with popular culture and cultural icons of various kinds, that's gone, no traces in the brain at all, and this persists over centuries, right? And that's really what I want to kind of get into. And part of it is my own bias is I'm always convinced there are material relations of power and even material relations of knowledge production that has something to do with it. And I suspect I'm not saying anything you don't agree with, but I wonder for the sake of this conversation if we could get into that a little bit more. So I'm thinking specifically about the practices of body snatching for people who don't have the benefit, the privileges of loved ones who can protect their bodies after death, and maybe not even during life. People whose bodies end up as part of a pedagogical tool at a medical school like Penn. Not just for decades, not just for a century, but maybe for 150 years, maybe longer. Does that matter? Does it matter that for the continuity issue, that some of the same ways of teaching medicine in the material basis of those ways are still there? Or should we look to, I don't know, old guys who are still teaching medicine in the late 19th century, who started in the beginning? I mean, is it the population of students who become doctors? So I just want to throw those out to you and see if we can get in the weeds a little bit on that, and thinking of the disappearance of Mae West and Josephine Baker, right?
So immediately I thought, why those kind of ideas about who was culture kind of dissipate, but these ideas about blackness and biology persist. It's because anti-blackness persists. It's changed in different forms. There are different iterations of anti-black racism, but it persists. And, so it persists in medicine because it literally, as I said before, it forms the building block. It's the basis of American medicine. And American medicine is supposed to be value neutral. So people, they trust what doctors and scientists have to say, right? They don't necessarily believe people, who write history, or people who are singers or actresses and those kinds of things. So there's something deeply attractive about anti-blackness when it comes to race, science, and medicine. Because at least you can say, see, biology, science backs us up that these people are broken, they're pathological, that they're not quite human, they're not quite normal. And so when some, oftentimes when I hear about the kind of rise of the alt-right, it happens every couple of decades. I was in college in the 90s and they were called neo-Nazis, right? But the thing is, they continue to use that same old 19th century racial science, that a Samuel Cartwright or Josiah Nott uses. And so for me, I'm like, anti-blackness persists. Now, in terms of the value, though, of black bodies alive and dead, and I wish I don't see her here, but I know Donna Rainey Berry is going to be here, and she writes about that in the book, The Price for the Pound of Flesh. There is a value, though, in having possession of the black body, in slavery and in freedom. And so here you can have live bodies to experiment on during slavery, where you have easy access, as long as you have the permission of the owner to examine and or fix that damaged property, right? You can do that. When they're dead, the cadaver still has value. The organs still have value. And so lest we think that this is just, the kind of idea of some mean boogeyman, this was a part of the structure. When we think about Cuvier and the Hottentot Venus of Sarah Bartman, literally his treatment of her cadaver and the display of her reproductive organs, her brain, her skeleton, literally becomes the exemplar for how doctors across the pond in the United States write about and treat black women in terms of medical science. And so, I think a part of it is finally having these kinds of conversations that go beyond these kind of individual experiences and connecting them to something longer, deeper, and structural, is how you begin to finally dismantle it.
Yeah, I like to say that race, the concept of biological race, that all human beings are naturally divided into races that are biologically distinct from each other, was invented for political purposes, and it continues because it continues to be useful for political purposes. And the main purpose, I think, as we both emphasized, is to be able to explain away continued structural racism and white supremacy as just these negative outcomes are because of the natural products of pathological or genetically, whether you say it's pathological because of God created black people that way, or you say it's pathological because nature created people that way, or it's pathological because their brains evolved that way, or their genes evolved that way. It's the same idea dressed up in scientifically accurate methods and terms, but the basic fundamental idea remains the same. And so it appears as if it's changing. We're less racist today. We're more scientific today. But if the basic idea is the same, then you could dress it up in seemingly more accurate and precise and objective methods, but you're going to end up with the same ideology and the same kinds of results. Now, having said that, there are ways in which materially the exact same studies are regurgitated over and over and over again. There's some practices that if you ask, why do doctors do this today? And it seems it must be because of some advanced study that, that they discovered this difference. And you look and you find out, well, actually, it was a study from the 1940s, that where black people were experimented on, and this idea has stuck in modern medicine. In fact, the idea that black people have lower lung capacity and so spirometer readings have to be corrected came from Samuel Cartwright, and yet there are doctors today that use spirometers that automatically correct for race. It was based on studying medical students and residents at the University of Virginia, and they found that a significant number of those residents and medical students, and I would highlight residents because the residents have graduated from medical school, believe myths about black people's bodies, like black people have thicker skin than white people. Black people have less sensitive nerve endings than white people. And the researchers found that those students were more likely to undertreat black patients for pain, which is a common problem in medical practice, that black people are much less likely to receive pain medication or receive less of it than white patients for the same kinds of injuries. And so you might ask, well, where would residents get these ideas? They're treating patients. They're harming patients today by undertreating their pain because of their race. Probably the medical classes did not teach them these things. I hope not. But when they come into medical school and they're taught that there are all these innate differences between black people and other human beings, it reinforces these myths that they had when they came into medical school. There's nothing in that type of education that would discredit that view. If they were taught instead that there is nothing innately abnormal about black people's bodies, that in treating a patient, you should treat the patient according to the patient's symptoms and their individual characteristics, and that you should be structurally competent. You should understand the way in which racism and other forms of inequality affect health. Then maybe they would be dispelled of those ideas about differences in people's bodies. But medical education continues in the way that it was taught in very fundamental ways. Back at the beginning of Penn Medical School when Samuel Cartwright was trained here. And so those are just some of the ways that these ideas continue to circulate despite the fact that your students can't remember or haven't learned about recent
Amnesia,
history.
right, cultural amnesia.
Cultural amnesia,
Right.
but race gets repeated, these ideas about race. And race is also considered a natural, uncomplicated variable that doesn't have to be critically examined. And so you find lots of studies, again, with very complicated examination of every other variable, but race is plugged in as if it's just natural, that the researcher can just tell what race people are. Like a doctor could just tell because you're black, you must have these symptoms or you're going to have these outcomes. And it's fascinating how, and disturbing, how so many researchers treat it as if it's just a natural aspect of nature, and therefore there's no need to question its relationship to racism.